The city was quiet, almost painfully so, the kind of silence that pressed against your chest and made every step echo. I hurried down the narrow alley behind the clinic, my worn sneakers slapping against the cracked pavement. The late evening air was sharp, carrying the smell of rain-soaked asphalt and exhaust. I had been walking for nearly 10 minutes, my mind replaying every moment of the day, every sobbing child, every frantic parent, every piece of progress that had felt just out of reach. My bag, heavy with therapy notes and colored pencils, bounced against my hip, a constant reminder of responsibility. I rounded a corner and froze, a black SUV idling silently beneath the flickering streetlight. From the tinted windows, I could see the silhouette of a man stepping out, the way he moved precise, deliberate, with a weight in his presence that seemed to bend the light around him. I had heard whispers of men like him, rumors at the hospital, but now the legend was here, real and intimidating, inches away. He studied me with eyes that were pale, penetrating, as if measuring the exact level of threat I posed. My chest tightened, every instinct screaming to run, yet my feet felt rooted to the wet concrete. He took a step closer, his tailored suit absorbing the dim light, exuding an authority that made the air heavier. "You were taking care of him," he said quietly, his voice calm yet loaded, like a storm held in reserve. My heart pounded, but I managed a quiet, "I was just doing my job." That simple statement seemed to amuse him or perhaps challenge him. He moved around me, surveying, and when his gaze returned to mine, it was like a tether had been thrown across the space separating us. My mind raced, trying to anticipate his next move, yet each breath I drew felt inadequate against the presence towering over me. Then, in a motion both swift and controlled, he reached forward, laying a hand on my shoulder, firm but not harsh. The contact sent a shiver down my spine, grounding me in the reality of this encounter. "You were mine the moment you saved him," he said, his tone asserting ownership without question, without cruelty. I swallowed, conflicted, unsure whether to resist or accept the undeniable pull of the situation. The world around us seemed to fade, the distant hum of traffic, the neon signs, the dripping gutters, all fading into a backdrop for the singular tension between us. I wanted to pull away, to insist on boundaries, yet there was an undeniable weight to his claim, a promise of protection intertwined with power. As I stood there, caught between fear and something unidentifiable, his eyes never left mine, holding, commanding, binding. The rain began again, softly at first, dripping from the edges of nearby roofs, yet it seemed inconsequential, almost gentle, compared to the intensity pressing in from the man before me. I realized then, with a clarity that sent chills through my body, that the night had irrevocably changed the course of my life. He was not just observing, not merely protecting, he was declaring a presence, an insistence that I could not ignore. I took a hesitant step back, testing the boundaries of the unspoken, yet the tether of his gaze anchored me, resisting my retreat. "You belong with me," he whispered, the words a promise, a command, and a reassurance all at once. My mind swirled with questions, with fear, with the shocking clarity of my own helplessness in the presence of such unyielding authority. And yet, beneath it all, a faint, unexpected warmth began to bloom in the pit of my chest, a fragile ember of trust, or perhaps inevitability, that dared to suggest I might not be entirely alone in the storm that had just begun around us. The drive home should have taken 15 minutes. Instead, it took nearly 40 because I kept checking my mirrors. Every pair of headlights felt suspicious. Every black vehicle made my pulse jump. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in a steady rhythm, fighting against the drizzle that had settled over the city. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building, my nerves felt stretched thin enough to snap. My studio apartment sat on the 3rd floor above a laundromat that never seemed to close. Normally, the smell of detergent drifting through the hallway felt comforting. Familiar. Tonight, it only reminded me how exhausted I was. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, releasing a breath I had not realized I had been holding. Silence greeted me. No family waiting. No messages. No one asking how my day had gone. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rumble of traffic outside. I dropped my bag onto the couch and headed toward the kitchen. Halfway there, I stopped. A white box sat on the counter. My stomach tightened instantly. I knew I had not left it there. The apartment manager had a key. So did maintenance. But somehow I already knew who had sent it. Slowly, I approached. The box was simple. No ribbon. No note visible from the outside. My fingers hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside sat a collection of expensive pastries from a bakery nearly 20 miles away. The kind of place I only passed when taking patients to specialist appointments in Manhattan. Beneath the box was a folded card. Just 3 words. Eat something first. I stared at the handwriting. Sharp. Controlled. Confident. My heart began hammering. How did he know I had skipped dinner? How did he know where I lived? The questions chased each other through my head as I picked up the card again. There was no signature. There did not need to be one. I already knew. I should have been angry. Maybe terrified. Instead, I found myself sitting at the kitchen counter, staring at the pastries while rain tapped softly against the window. The truth was embarrassing. Nobody had checked on me in a very long time. Nobody had noticed when I forgot meals. Nobody had paid enough attention to know I lived on coffee and determination. Yet somehow he had. That realization unsettled me more than anything else. My phone buzzed suddenly. I nearly dropped it. An unknown number flashed across the screen. I considered ignoring it. Then curiosity won. The message was short. Did you eat? I actually laughed. A nervous, disbelieving laugh that echoed through the apartment. The audacity was unbelievable. I typed a response before I could stop myself. How did you get this number? 3 dots appeared immediately. Then another message. That is not an answer. I stared at the screen. Somewhere out there, a man powerful enough to make entire hospital wings fall silent was waiting for my reply. It should have frightened me. Instead, I found myself smiling despite every warning bell in my head. I took a bite of one pastry and snapped a photo of the empty wrapper 5 minutes later. Then I sent it. The response came less than 10 seconds later. Good. For reasons I could not explain, warmth spread through my chest. Dangerous warmth. The kind that made people lower their guard. The kind that made them forget how carefully they had built their walls. Outside, the rain continued falling across the city. Somewhere beneath those storm clouds, he was watching over a son who had finally spoken through drawings and silence. And somewhere between fear and curiosity, I realized I was thinking about him far more than I should have been. The following morning arrived with a soft drizzle that made the city look blurred and watercolor-like through my apartment window. Steam rose from the streets as early commuters hurried past, umbrellas bouncing in rhythm with their steps. I sipped my cold coffee, my mind restless, fingers tapping against the chipped mug, tracing the cracks like lines on a map I could not read. The box from last night sat empty on the counter, a silent reminder that he had been here in some form, near enough to control the smallest details of my routine without ever appearing. The phone buzzed again. Another message. Short. Precise. Make sure he eats breakfast. My stomach tightened. It was uncanny, almost invasive, yet oddly grounding. I typed back, silently reprimanding myself for replying at all. I am fine. 3 dots appeared. Then the reply, you were not when you first walked out last night. The words pricked at my memory, the panic, the adrenaline, the almost imperceptible fear of someone watching, of someone ensuring I was safe. I finished my coffee slowly, thinking about the boy, the therapy sessions, the trust one had begun to build with him. Every action I took seemed amplified, measured against unseen eyes, yet strangely comforting. Later, I gathered my materials and headed to the clinic, taking the subway with its rattling tracks and flickering lights that made shadows dance against the walls. Each stop reminded me that the world outside my small domain moved with relentless energy, but the connection from last night lingered, a silent thread weaving through the noise. Inside the clinic, Carmen greeted me with her usual enthusiasm, unaware of the small but weighty presence that had entered my life. We prepared for the appointments, setting up the therapy room with meticulous care. The boy was waiting, seated on the small chair, fingers tracing the edge of the table. His gaze lifted as I entered, tentative, cautious. Yet, when our eyes met, there was recognition, a quiet understanding that trust would be rebuilt slowly, brick by brick. The session began with drawing, shapes and colors that told more than words ever could. He hesitated, then picked up a green pencil, motioning toward me to add something. I complied gently, watching him with careful attention, my own heart echoing the rhythm of his small movements. Minutes passed, yet felt like hours in the quiet intensity of the room. Then, as the session ended, I packed up the supplies and stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air that smelled faintly of wet concrete and spring blossoms from the neighboring park. My phone vibrated. Another message, brief. Good work today. Rest if you can. My hands shook slightly as I pocketed the phone, the warmth of his acknowledgement sending a shiver down my spine. I walked toward the subway, aware of every passerby, every flicker of light, yet buoyed by the invisible presence of someone who had declared ownership, not in possession alone, but in watchful protection. The city moved around me, chaotic, indifferent, yet in the rhythm of my steps, in the cadence of the rain and the distant horns, I could feel a tether, a fragile yet unbreakable thread stretching from his gaze to mine, pulling me forward, promising a presence that both haunted and safeguarded my every moment. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the tall windows of the clinic, casting long stripes across the worn linoleum floor. I adjusted the blinds slightly, the brightness making my eyes water after hours in dim rooms, yet the warmth on my skin felt strangely grounding. Carmen was organizing files, her movements brisk, almost rehearsed, but I barely noticed her today. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the subtle message he had sent this morning, reminding me that someone powerful was aware of my routine, my choices, my very survival. I gathered the colored pencils and therapy sheets for my next appointment, careful to line them up in the exact order I always used. The boy arrived, small feet padding softly against the floor, a hesitant smile on his face. His eyes met mine briefly before he settled into his seat, fingers brushing over the edge of the table, tracing imaginary patterns as if measuring the distance between the past and the present. We started with the drawings, gentle shapes, abstract colors, and then he moved on to letters, forming words that were carefully constructed yet heavy with meaning. I mirrored his movements, writing alongside him, the faint scratching of pencils against paper filling the silence. Outside, the streets buzzed with distant traffic, the occasional siren cutting through the hum, but inside the room, time slowed to the rhythm of small hands and concentrated focus. After an hour, he leaned back, satisfied, a tiny sigh escaping his lips. I packed away the materials slowly, making sure each piece of paper was flat, each pencil returned to its spot, aware that the order of things brought him comfort. On my way out, the phone buzzed. A message, simple, no emojis, no flourishes, well done. Make sure to eat something before you leave. I stared at it, the words carrying an unspoken weight, the same controlled authority that had defined our previous encounters. I typed a brief reply, acknowledging the instruction, and slipped the phone into my pocket. Walking toward the subway, the drizzle had returned, making the city glisten like wet glass. Umbrellas bobbed along the sidewalk, a wave of colors in motion, but my attention was drawn inward, tracing the connection that had silently formed. The sense of being observed, protected, and yet trusted, intertwined in a way that unsettled and comforted me simultaneously. I paused for a moment at the corner, listening to the distant honking, the soft swish of tires through puddles, and felt a strange stillness in my chest, a recognition that my world had shifted imperceptibly yet irreversibly. The tether between us was invisible, yet palpable, guiding my steps, quiet but insistent. And as the train rumbled beneath the city, carrying me toward home, I realized that even in the chaos of the streets, the uncertainty of the night, and the weight of my responsibilities, I was not alone. Somewhere beyond the shadows, beyond the reach of the rain and streetlights, he was watching, guiding, ensuring. The thought brought a cautious relief, tempered by the knowledge that this presence, this control, was both a safety and a challenge, demanding vigilance, respect, and a subtle surrender to the invisible lines that now defined my world. 3 days passed before I saw him again. 3 long days filled with therapy sessions, paperwork, subway rides, and messages that arrived with unsettling precision. Every morning there was a reminder to eat breakfast. Every evening there was a question asking whether I had made it home safely. The strange part was not that he kept checking on me. The strange part was that I had started expecting it. On Thursday evening, the sky hung low over Manhattan, heavy with dark clouds that threatened another storm. The clinic closed later than usual after a parent arrived nearly an hour late for an appointment. By the time I locked the front door, the sidewalks were almost empty. A cold wind swept down the street, carrying scraps of paper and the scent of incoming rain. I adjusted my coat and started toward the subway station. Halfway down the block, my phone vibrated. A single message appeared. Do not take the train tonight. I stopped walking immediately. My pulse quickened. Why? The reply came almost instantly. Because I asked you not to. I stared at the screen. A month ago I would have ignored a message like that. A week ago I would have been angry. Instead, I found myself looking around the street as if expecting an explanation to appear. The first raindrop landed on my cheek. Then another. Then dozens. Within seconds the storm broke open above the city. Thunder rolled across the skyline. Cars splashed through growing puddles. People rushed beneath awnings and storefronts. I stood frozen beneath a street lamp, trying to decide whether I was being unreasonable or simply cautious. Then a black SUV pulled quietly to the curb beside me. My heart nearly stopped. The rear passenger door opened. Warm light spilled onto the wet sidewalk. I should have walked away. Every survival instinct I had spent years developing told me not to get into a vehicle with a man whose influence reached places I could barely comprehend. Instead, I found myself stepping closer. He was sitting inside, dressed in a charcoal suit, one hand resting against the armrest. The city lights flashed across his features as traffic moved around us. For the first time, there were no hospital walls between us. No messages. No distance. Just him. His eyes lifted from the tablet in his hand and settled on mine. Calm. Steady. Unreadable. Get in before you catch pneumonia, he said. The absurdity of the statement almost made me laugh. I climbed inside. The door closed behind me with a soft click. Immediately the noise of the storm disappeared. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Warmth wrapped around me. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Rain streaked across the windows while the driver pulled smoothly back into traffic. Finally, I turned toward him. You cannot keep ordering me around. One corner of his mouth moved slightly. Was that what I was doing? Yes. Absolutely yes. His gaze returned to the city outside. Yet you got into the vehicle. I opened my mouth and immediately closed it again. He was infuriating. The silence stretched before he spoke again. My son asked about you today. The statement caught me completely off guard. The shift in topic was so unexpected that I blinked. He asked when you were coming back. Something softened in his voice. Not much. Just enough for me to notice. The powerful man who could command entire rooms suddenly sounded like a father. The realization changed something inside me. For the first time, he felt less like an untouchable force and more like a human being carrying responsibilities larger than himself. Outside, lightning illuminated the skyline. Inside the SUV, neither of us looked away. The SUV pulled into a quiet street lined with old brick buildings, the rain having softened into a gentle mist that settled over the pavement. I watched droplets trace paths along the windows, distorted reflections of streetlights glimmering like fragments of distant stars. He parked with precision, the engine cutting off in a smooth silence that made the space feel suspended in time. I hesitated before opening the door, suddenly aware of how exposed the street was, how ordinary it seemed compared to the careful containment inside the vehicle. He stepped out first, his presence somehow extending beyond his body, filling the narrow sidewalk with the weight of authority and expectation. I followed, careful, measured. As we walked toward a small cafe tucked between two buildings, I noticed the way he navigated the space, eyes scanning, assessing, yet not intruding, a silent guide through the mundane chaos of the city. We entered, the bell over the door chiming softly, and the smell of fresh bread and espresso enveloped us. I was acutely conscious of the contrast, the warmth and familiarity of the cafe against the cold calculation that seemed to surround him in every other setting. He ordered, his voice low, calm, and then gestured for me to choose. I picked a table near the window, the wet street outside offering a canvas of reflection and motion. For a moment, neither of us spoke, sipping coffee, the steam curling in the air, framing our shared silence. Finally, he looked at me, eyes sharp yet thoughtful. "You are different when you work with him," he said, and I felt the weight of observation, of understanding, settle over me. I nodded, unsure how to articulate the complex tangle of emotions and responsibility that defined my life. "He trusts you," he continued, voice even, carrying both admiration and caution. The words were small, but they pressed against me with the gravity of an unspoken truth. Someone had noticed my commitment, my resilience, and had judged it worthy. Outside, a car rolled by, headlights briefly illuminating the room, yet inside, the moment felt suspended, separate from the rest of the city, insulated in intensity. I realized then how much of my life had been about boundaries and survival, how much had been about carrying others while shielding myself, and how unfamiliar it felt to have someone recognize my efforts without expectation, without demand. He studied me, a quiet calculation in his gaze that did not waver, yet it was tempered by something I could not name, perhaps a recognition of the unseen burdens I bore. I set down my cup, the warmth seeping through my fingers, and met his gaze fully for the first time without fear. Somewhere deep, I sensed a subtle shift, a moment where vigilance and caution yielded, however briefly, to acknowledgement and the possibility of trust. The drizzle outside thickened again, and I watched it coat the streets in silver, a mirror to the unspoken lines between us, fragile but undeniably present. In that shared space, amid coffee steam and softened rain, I realized that the tether between us was no longer just a shadow of control, it had become a thread of connection, fragile yet steady, a beginning of something neither of us could fully define but both felt impossible to ignore. The city lights flickered against wet streets as I stepped out of the cafe, the misty drizzle making the pavement glisten like liquid silver. Each breath I drew was cold, sharp, and real, reminding me of the small pulse of life that continued despite the weight pressing on my shoulders. The SUV waited at the curb, its polished surface reflecting the neon signs above, and I approached it cautiously, aware that stepping inside meant entering a world where boundaries were blurred but protection was absolute. He greeted me with a nod, eyes briefly meeting mine before returning to the darkened streets ahead. The driver merged into traffic, the city moving around us in blurred streaks of light, the sound of tires on wet asphalt a constant rhythm. I realized that this ride was different, quieter, almost deliberate, as if the air inside had been suspended, each movement measured, each moment stretched. We drove past familiar streets that had felt ordinary just hours ago, yet under his watchful gaze, they took on a new weight, a sense of layered meaning I could not fully articulate. Rain continued to coat the windows, droplets racing each other down the glass, distorting shapes and colors into abstract patterns that mirrored my tangled thoughts. He spoke finally, voice low, deliberate. "You cannot predict every outcome." I nodded, understanding that this was both a warning and an acknowledgement of the choices I had made, of the courage it took to navigate the chaos of my daily life while maintaining the delicate trust of the boy I helped. The city sprawled endlessly, yet in this confined space, every decision, every glance, carried significance far beyond its immediate consequence. My hands rested lightly on my lap, trembling slightly despite my effort to remain composed. Outside, the world continued in indifferent motion, yet inside, there was an intensity that demanded focus, presence, and understanding. I realized then that our connection had shifted subtly, from observation to awareness, from authority to a form of careful partnership, fragile yet undeniable. He glanced at me briefly, just enough to remind me of the tether between us, the invisible line that bound attention, protection, and expectation. For the first time, I felt that this presence, once so imposing, could coexist with my own agency, that he recognized both the responsibility I bore and the boundaries I sought to maintain. As the vehicle slowed near my building, I felt a subtle reluctance, an almost imperceptible hesitation at leaving the cocoon of control and awareness he provided. The door opened, and the rain greeted me again, cold and tangible, grounding me in reality. Yet as I stepped onto the sidewalk, I sensed that the thread between us had not been severed. It stretched into the night, taut and steady, a promise that, however uncertain, I was seen, acknowledged, and quietly safeguarded. The streets were empty now, save for the occasional passerby rushing to shelter, and I walked toward my apartment, footsteps echoing softly against the wet pavement, carrying with me the weight of recognition, the strange warmth of connection, and the knowledge that nothing would be the same again. The weekend arrived with a gray sky and persistent drizzle that coated the city in a soft, reflective sheen. I stepped out of my apartment building, umbrella in hand, and felt the familiar tug of anticipation mixed with unease. Every streetlight seemed to throw long shadows across the sidewalks, and the occasional splash from passing cars reminded me how wet and unpredictable the city could be. My phone vibrated in my pocket, and I paused, reading the message that appeared. Meet me at the park near the river. No further instructions. I hesitated, the rational part of my mind warning me to ignore it, yet another part, the part that had already come to trust him in strange, intangible ways, urged me forward. The subway ride was quiet, the hum of the train under the city creating a rhythmic comfort. Each stop brought me closer to the waterfront, and with each passing moment, my heartbeat seemed to echo the muffled clatter of rails. When I emerged onto the street, the rain had eased into a light mist, and the park stretched ahead, empty and serene, the benches glistening under the dampness. He was waiting near the riverbank, the silhouette of his figure outlined by the soft glow of a nearby lamppost. The mist seemed to cling to him, making him appear simultaneously closer and untouchable. I approached, careful to make my presence known but not to startle. He turned, his eyes meeting mine with the precision of someone who had memorized every detail of my mannerisms, yet there was a subtle warmth there now, a recognition of vulnerability and effort alike. You came, he said, voice low, calm, deliberate. I nodded, words failing me for a moment. I thought you might not, he continued, and I felt a flicker of emotion in the measured cadence of his speech. We walked together along the path, the soft squelch of wet shoes against grass and dirt marking each step, neither speaking for several long moments. I felt the weight of observation, the subtle awareness of his presence, as both protective and challenging. I glanced at him, noting the careful attention in his stance, the way his hands rested loosely at his sides, relaxed but alert, and wondered how he balanced such authority with the patience he extended to me. We reached a bench overlooking the river, mist curling off the water like smoke, and he gestured for me to sit. I did, still clutching my umbrella. He seated himself beside me, the space between us just enough to respect distance yet intimate in the understanding it held. We watched the water flow silently, the city reflected in scattered ripples, and I realized how much of the chaos from earlier days had subsided under his steady presence. I felt a cautious calm, a trust forming in the silent exchange, and understood that the tether between us had evolved. It was no longer just about observation, control, or guidance. It had become a shared awareness, a quiet acknowledgement that our paths were intertwined in ways neither of us fully commanded but both felt necessary. The mist thickened, and I breathed in the cool, damp air, feeling the subtle shift in the balance of fear, trust, and something quietly profound. He glanced at me once, a faint acknowledgement in his eyes that spoke volumes, and in that glance, I knew that the world outside the park existed, but within this space, our connection was absolute, fragile, and enduring.